She was the unwanted burden in a house that never called her daughter, the shadow in corners where love should have lived, the girl who learned that family could be the cruelest strangers of all. For 22 years, she endured their cold indifference, believing herself unworthy of affection. But when the wealthiest duke in England looked at her with eyes that saw not shame but strength, everything changed. He would risk his fortune, defy his peers, and challenge the very foundations of society. All for a woman the world had taught to believe she was nothing. Some called it madness, others called it the love story that proved even the most broken hearts could find their perfect match. The morning Isabel Harrow turned 22, she woke to the sound of her cousin Margaret's shrill laughter, echoing through the corridors of Thornfield Manor. It was not the laughter of celebration, but the cruel mirth that had punctuated Isabel's entire existence in this house, a constant reminder that she would never truly belong. Can you imagine? Margaret was saying to her sister Penelope as Isabel descended the servants' stairs, carrying the breakfast tray she had prepared herself. 22 years old and still unmarried, still living off our charity like some pathetic spinster. Father should have sent her to the workhouse years ago. Isabel paused on the landing, her hands tightening on the silver tray. She had heard such words countless times before, but they never stopped cutting deep. The Harrow family had taken her in after her parents' death when she was 5, but they had never let her forget that she was there on sufferance, a burden they bore out of reluctant duty rather than love. "Now, girls," came the voice of their mother, Mrs. Cordelia Harrow, though her tone held no real reproof. "Isabel serves her purpose. Who else would manage the household accounts so efficiently, or tend to the gardens with such skill? She earns her keep, I suppose." Earns her keep. The words stung more than outright cruelty. Isabel was not family. She was an unpaid servant, tolerated for her usefulness, but never valued for herself. She entered the breakfast room with practiced invisibility, setting down the tray and beginning to serve the family that had never truly accepted her. Her uncle, Mr. Thomas Harrow, barely glanced up from his newspaper. Her cousins, Margaret and Penelope, continued their conversation as if she were furniture. Only Mrs. Harrow acknowledged her presence, and then only to issue orders. "Isabel, the silver needs polishing today, and do something about the roses. They're looking rather shabby. We can't have the garden looking unkempt when the Ashworth family calls this afternoon." "Yes, ma'am," Isabel replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She had learned long ago that speaking too loudly, showing too much personality, only invited criticism and punishment. "Oh, and Isabel," Margaret added with false sweetness, "do try to stay out of sight when the Ashworths arrive. We wouldn't want them to think we're harboring charity cases." The casual cruelty of the comment made Isabel's cheeks burn, but she simply nodded and began clearing the breakfast dishes. She had endured 22 years of such treatment. What was one more day? But as she worked in the kitchen, washing dishes and preparing for the day's tasks, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this morning. Perhaps it was the significance of her birthday, or perhaps it was simply that she had finally reached the limit of her endurance. For the first time in years, she found herself wondering what life might be like beyond the walls of Thornfield Manor. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had no money, no connections, no prospects beyond the dubious security of her current situation, but she also had skills. She could read and write, manage accounts, tend gardens, run a household. Surely there was some position, some opportunity that would allow her to escape this prison of indifference. Her reverie was interrupted by the arrival of a letter, delivered by a boy from the village. Mrs. Harrow opened it at the breakfast table, her expression growing increasingly grim as she read. "Thomas," she said sharply, "we need to discuss this immediately." Isabel continued her work, but she couldn't help overhearing the urgent whispers that followed. Something about debts, about creditors, about the possibility of losing the estate. The Harrow family, for all their airs and pretensions, were apparently in serious financial trouble. "What about Isabel?" she heard Margaret ask. "Surely we can't afford to keep her on if we're facing ruin." "No," Mrs. Harrow replied firmly. "We cannot. She'll have to go." The words hit Isabel like a physical blow. After 22 years of reluctant tolerance, she was finally being cast out entirely. The irony was not lost on her. On the day she had been contemplating escape, the decision was being made for her. That afternoon, as the Ashworth family's elegant carriage pulled up to Thornfield Manor, Isabel found herself summoned to Mrs. Harrow's private sitting room. Her aunt, though the woman had never encouraged Isabel to use that term, sat behind her writing desk like a judge preparing to deliver sentence. "Isabel," she began without preamble, "our circumstances have changed. We can no longer afford to maintain you in this household." Isabel had expected this moment, but hearing the words spoken aloud still felt like a knife to the heart. "I understand, ma'am. When would you like me to leave?" "Tomorrow morning," Mrs. Harrow replied coldly. "I've arranged for you to take a position as a governess with a family in Yorkshire. The wages are modest, but it's honest work, and it's more than you have any right to expect. A governess in Yorkshire, hundreds of miles from everything she had ever known, working for strangers who would likely treat her with the same indifference she had endured here. It was not the escape she had dreamed of, but it was freedom of a sort. "Thank you for the arrangement," Isabel said quietly. "I'll be ready to leave in the morning." Mrs. Harrow nodded curtly. "See that you are. And Isabel, you'll take nothing from this house beyond the clothes on your back. Everything here belongs to the family, and you are not family." The final blow was delivered with surgical precision, designed to remind Isabel once and for all of her place in the world. She was nothing, nobody, a charity case being shuffled from one uncomfortable situation to another. That evening, as the Harrow family entertained their guests in the drawing room, Isabel packed her meager belongings into a single worn carpet bag. She owned little beyond a few simple dresses, some undergarments, and a small collection of books she had managed to acquire over the years. It was a pathetic accumulation for 22 years of life, but it was all she had. As she folded her clothes, she could hear the sounds of laughter and conversation from below. The Ashworths were wealthy, influential people, and the Harrows were clearly trying to make a good impression despite their financial difficulties. Isabel wondered if they would mention her departure, or if she would simply disappear from their lives as quietly as she had lived in them. She was just closing her bag when she heard a commotion from the courtyard below. Looking out her small window, she saw a magnificent carriage pulling up to the house, far grander than the Ashworth's vehicle, with a ducal crest emblazoned on the door. The driver and footman wore livery of the finest quality, and everything about the equipage spoke of immense wealth and power. Isabel watched in fascination as a tall, imposing figure emerged from the carriage. Even from her window she could see that he was a man of extraordinary presence, broad-shouldered, elegantly dressed, and carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of the highest aristocracy. This was clearly a duke, though she couldn't imagine what business such a man would have with the Harrows. The sight of such magnificence only emphasized her own insignificance. Tomorrow, she would be gone from this place, forgotten by the family that had never truly seen her, beginning a new life of servitude with strangers. The contrast between her fate and the obvious power and privilege of the man below was almost laughable. But as she watched him stride toward the house, something stirred in Isabel's chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was something close to it. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that her ordeal here was finally ending, or perhaps it was the realization that there was a whole world beyond Thornfield Manor, a world where men like the Duke below lived lives of purpose and meaning. Whatever the future held for her, it had to be better than the past 22 years of rejection and indifference. Tomorrow, Isabel Harrow would begin a new chapter of her life, and for the first time in memory, she felt something approaching anticipation rather than dread. She didn't know it yet, but the arrival of the Duke below would change everything, not just for the Harrow family, but for her as well. Sometimes fate arrived in the most unexpected forms, and sometimes salvation came from the most unlikely sources. As she settled into bed for her last night at Thornfield Manor, Isabel allowed herself to dream of a future where she might finally find the acceptance and belonging that had always eluded her. It seemed impossible, but then again, she had learned that life had a way of surprising even the most resigned hearts. The Duke's arrival. Richard Montague, the 7th Duke of Westmere, had not intended to stop at Thornfield Manor. His journey to his northern estates was meant to be swift and efficient, with only necessary stops for rest and refreshment. But when his carriage had developed a problem with one of its wheels, his coachman had recommended the Harrow estate as the nearest place to seek assistance. Now standing in the modest but well-appointed drawing room of Thornfield Manor, Richard found himself regretting the decision. Thomas Harrow was a man clearly desperate to impress, fawning over his unexpected ducal guest with an enthusiasm that bordered on the pathetic. His wife and daughters were little better, simpering and curtsying with such frequency that Richard wondered if they suffered from some sort of nervous condition. "Your Grace," Thomas Harrow was saying for the 3rd time in as many minutes, What an extraordinary honor this is. Please allow me to offer you refreshment while your carriage is being attended to." Richard accepted a glass of brandy more out of politeness than desire, his keen eyes taking in the details of the room. The furnishings were quality pieces, but they showed signs of age and wear. The silver service, while well polished, was of an older style that suggested it hadn't been updated in decades. Everything spoke of a family trying to maintain appearances, despite reduced circumstances. "I do hope the repairs won't take too long," he said diplomatically. "I'm expected at Westmere Park by tomorrow evening." "Of course, Your Grace," Mrs. Harrow interjected, shooting her husband a meaningful look. "Though perhaps you might consider staying for dinner? It would be such an honor to have you at our table." Richard was preparing to politely decline when a movement in the garden caught his eye. Through the tall windows, he could see a young woman working among the roses, her movements graceful and purposeful as she tended to the flowers. Unlike the overdressed ladies in the drawing room, she wore a simple dress of pale blue muslin, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical style that somehow managed to be more elegant than all of Margaret and Penelope's elaborate curls. "Who is that in the garden?" he asked, his attention completely captured by the figure outside. The effect of his question on the Harrow family was immediate and dramatic. Mrs. Harrow's face flushed with embarrassment, while her daughters exchanged horrified glances. Thomas Harrow cleared his throat uncomfortably. That is Isabel, Your Grace. She's been staying with us for some years, but she's leaving tomorrow to take up a position elsewhere." There was something in the man's tone that suggested there was much more to the story, but Richard found himself more interested in watching the young woman in the garden than in pursuing the family's obvious discomfort. She moved with a natural grace that spoke of good breeding, and there was something about her bearing that suggested inner strength and dignity. "She seems very capable," Richard observed, noting how expertly she handled the roses, cutting away dead blooms and training new growth with practiced skill. "Oh yes," Margaret said quickly. "Isabel is very useful. She's quite good with household management and such things." The dismissive tone in which she spoke about the young woman irritated Richard more than he cared to analyze. There was something about the way the family discussed Isabel, as if she were a servant rather than a guest, that struck him as fundamentally wrong. "Perhaps you might introduce me," he said suddenly, surprising himself as much as his hosts. "I have some interest in horticulture, and she seems to know what she's about with those roses." The suggestion clearly horrified the Harrow family. Mrs. Harrow's face went pale, while her daughters looked as if he had suggested introducing him to the scullery maid. "Your Grace," Thomas Harrow said carefully, "I'm not sure that would be... That is, Isabel is not really... She's not quite what?" Richard asked, his voice taking on a dangerous edge that made the man step back involuntarily. "She's not quite family, Your Grace," Mrs. Harrow finished reluctantly. She's an orphan we took in out of charity. We've done our best for her, but she's not really suited for meeting persons of your elevated station." The explanation only served to increase Richard's interest. An orphan raised by this family, but clearly not considered part of it. That would explain the dismissive way they spoke of her, and perhaps the dignity he had observed in her bearing. She had learned to carry herself with grace, despite being treated as less than equal. "I think I can judge for myself whether someone is suited to meet me," Richard said coolly. "If you would be so kind as to ask her to join us." It was phrased as a request, but the tone made it clear that it was actually a command. Thomas Harrow had no choice but to bow and mutter something about fetching Isabel immediately. A few minutes later, the drawing-room door opened to admit the young woman Richard had been watching in the garden. Up close, she was even more striking than he had realized. She had the kind of beauty that didn't announce itself immediately, but grew more apparent the longer one looked. Dark hair that caught the light, intelligent brown eyes, and features that spoke of both strength and sensitivity. But it was her manner that truly impressed him. Despite the obvious discomfort of the Harrow family and her own uncertain position, she entered the room with quiet dignity, offering a perfect curtsy without any of the affected mannerisms he had observed in the daughters of the house. "Your Grace," she said simply, her voice low and musical, "I'm honored to meet you." "Miss Isabel," Richard replied, noting how the family had failed to provide her surname, another small cruelty that spoke volumes about her position in the household. "I was admiring your work in the garden. You have considerable skill with roses." A faint flush of pleasure colored her cheeks at the compliment. "Thank you, Your Grace. I find gardening very rewarding work, indeed. I'm something of an enthusiast myself, Perhaps you might show me what you've been doing with that climbing rose by the south wall. It looks to be a particularly fine specimen." The suggestion clearly appalled the Harrow family, but Isabel's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "I would be delighted, Your Grace. It's actually a rather interesting variety. I've been experimenting with different training techniques to encourage more abundant blooming." As they moved toward the garden, Richard was acutely aware of the whispered conversation behind them. The Harrows were clearly beside themselves at this turn of events, but he found he cared little for their discomfort. There was something about Isabel that intrigued him, a combination of intelligence, grace, and quiet strength that was far more appealing than all the calculated charm of the debutantes he usually encountered. In the garden, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the drawing room, Isabel seemed to come alive. She spoke knowledgeably about different rose varieties, soil conditions, and pruning techniques, her passion for the subject evident in every word. Richard found himself genuinely engaged in the conversation, impressed by her knowledge and insight. "You've clearly made a study of horticulture," he observed, as she demonstrated a particular grafting technique. "Where did you learn so much about it?" "From books, mostly," Isabel replied, her cheeks coloring slightly. "The Harrows have a good library, and I've always been fond of reading. I found several excellent treatises on gardening and decided to put the theories into practice." "Self-taught, then? That's even more impressive." Richard studied her face as she worked, noting the way her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm when she discussed something she cared about. "And what other subjects have you studied in this library of theirs?" "Oh, a little of everything," Isabel said modestly. "History, literature, some mathematics and natural philosophy. I find learning fascinating, though I suppose it's not very practical for someone in my position." "On the contrary," Richard said firmly, "I think knowledge is always practical. An educated mind is never wasted, regardless of one's circumstances." Isabel looked up at him with surprise, as if she had never heard such a sentiment before. "That's very kind of you to say, Your Grace." "It's not kindness, it's truth." Richard found himself studying her face more intently than was perhaps proper. There was something about her that drew him, something beyond her obvious intelligence and grace. Perhaps it was the way she seemed to bloom under genuine attention and respect, as if such treatment was foreign to her experience. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Richard's coachman, who reported that the repairs to the carriage were complete. Richard felt an unexpected pang of disappointment at the news. He had been enjoying his conversation with Isabel more than any social interaction he could remember in recent years. "Thank you for showing me your garden," he said formally, though his eyes conveyed a warmth that made Isabel's heart skip. "It's been most educational." "The pleasure was mine, Your Grace," Isabel replied, dropping another perfect curtsy. "I hope your journey to Westmere Park is pleasant." As Richard returned to the drawing room to take his leave of the Harrow family, he found himself thinking about the young woman he was leaving behind. There was something profoundly wrong about her situation, a woman of obvious breeding and intelligence being treated as a charity case by people who were clearly her inferiors in every way that mattered. "Thank you for your hospitality," he said to Thomas Harrow, though his tone was notably cooler than when he had arrived. "I trust Miss Isabel will be well situated in her new position." "Oh yes," Mrs. Harrow said quickly. "We've arranged everything very carefully. She'll be quite comfortable, I'm sure." Richard doubted that very much, but there was little he could do about it at the moment. As his carriage pulled away from Thornfield Manor, he found himself looking back at the garden where Isabel still worked among her roses, unaware that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The Duke of Westmere was not a man given to impulsive actions, but as he settled back against the leather seats of his carriage, he was already formulating a plan. Isabel Harrow, for he was determined to discover her full name and history, deserved better than the cold charity of the family that had raised her, and Richard Montague had both the means and the inclination to ensure she received it. Sometimes fate worked in mysterious ways, and sometimes a chance encounter could change the course of two lives forever. As his carriage rolled toward Westmere Park, Richard found himself anticipating the future with an excitement he hadn't felt in years. Isabel Harrow was about to discover that she had made a very powerful ally, though she didn't know it yet. And the Duke of Westmere was about to embark on the most important mission of his life, rescuing a woman who had never known she was worth saving. The rescue. 3 weeks after his unexpected encounter at Thornfield Manor, Richard Montague found himself unable to concentrate on anything but the memory of a dark-haired woman working among roses. He had tried to dismiss Isabel from his thoughts, telling himself that his interest was merely the natural sympathy any decent person would feel for someone in unfortunate circumstances. But as the days passed, he was forced to acknowledge that his feelings ran much deeper than simple compassion. The realization had come to him during a particularly tedious dinner party at his London townhouse, where he had been surrounded by the cream of society. Beautiful, accomplished women who should have commanded his attention, but left him feeling nothing but polite boredom. As Lady Sophia Pemberton simpered at him over the soup course, Richard had found himself thinking about Isabel's genuine enthusiasm for her roses, the way her eyes had lit up when she discussed something she truly cared about. That was when he knew he had to act. His first step had been to make discreet inquiries about the Harrow family and their circumstances. What he discovered only reinforced his growing conviction that Isabel deserved far better than the fate that awaited her. The Harrows were indeed in serious financial difficulty, having made a series of poor investments that had left them deeply in debt. Their estate was mortgaged to the hilt, and creditors were beginning to circle like vultures. More disturbing was what he learned about Isabel's position in the household. Through careful questioning of servants and tradespeople in the area, Richard pieced together a picture of a young woman who had been treated more like an unpaid servant than a family member, despite her obvious breeding and intelligence. She had been given the most menial tasks, excluded from family gatherings, and made to feel like a burden rather than a beloved ward. The information only strengthened his resolve. Isabel Harrow needed rescuing, and Richard Montague was exactly the man to do it. His second step had been to investigate the position the Harrows had arranged for her in Yorkshire. A few well-placed inquiries revealed that the Blackwood family were notorious for their harsh treatment of servants and governesses. Their previous governess had lasted only 6 months before fleeing in the middle of the night, and the one before that had suffered what was delicately termed a nervous collapse. The thought of Isabel in such an environment was intolerable. On a crisp October morning, Richard's carriage once again pulled up to Thornfield Manor, but this time his arrival was no accident. He had come with a specific purpose, and he was prepared to use every ounce of his considerable influence to achieve it. Thomas Harrow greeted him with the same fawning enthusiasm as before, clearly hoping that the Duke's return might somehow solve his financial problems. Richard allowed the man to escort him into the drawing-room, where Mrs. Harrow and her daughters waited with barely concealed excitement. "Your Grace," Thomas began, "what an unexpected pleasure." "I do hope—" "I'll come straight to the point," Richard interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "I'm here about Miss Isabel. I understand she's to leave for Yorkshire today?" The family exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Yes, Your Grace," Mrs. Harrow replied carefully. "We've arranged a very suitable position for her as a governess. She should be quite comfortable." "I think not," Richard said coolly. "I've made some inquiries about the Blackwood family. Their reputation for the treatment of their staff is unfortunate. I cannot allow Miss Isabel to enter such a situation." "Allow?" Margaret spoke up, her voice sharp with confusion. "Your Grace, I don't understand. What concern is Isabel's situation to you?" Richard turned his full attention to the young woman, his blue eyes cold as winter ice. "Miss Isabel is a person of obvious intelligence and breeding who deserves to be treated with respect and consideration, something she has clearly not received in this household." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Mrs. Harrow's face flushed red with indignation, while her daughters looked shocked at the Duke's blunt criticism. "Your Grace," Thomas Harrow began, his voice trembling with nervous energy, "I assure you that we have always treated Isabel with the utmost—" "Have you?" Richard's voice cut through the man's protestations like a blade. "Have you treated her as a member of your family? Have you provided her with the education, the opportunities, the affection that any young woman in your care deserves, or have you used her as unpaid labor while making her feel grateful for the privilege?" The silence that followed was deafening. The Harrow family clearly had no answer to his accusations because they knew them to be true. "I have a proposition," Richard continued, his manner becoming more businesslike. "I am in need of someone to oversee the restoration of the gardens at Westmere Park. It's a position that would require considerable knowledge of horticulture, as well as the ability to manage staff and coordinate with architects and landscape designers. The salary would be £50 per year, plus room and board in the main house." The amount was staggering, more than many gentlemen earned in a year, and far beyond what any governess could expect. The Harrow family stared at him in shock, clearly unable to comprehend why he would offer such a position to someone they considered little better than a servant. "Your Grace," Mrs. Harrow said faintly. That's very generous, but surely Isabel isn't qualified for such a responsible position. On the contrary, Richard replied firmly, I believe she's exactly what I'm looking for. I was most impressed by her knowledge and skill during my previous visit. The question is whether she would be interested in accepting such a position. That is, we would need to discuss it with Isabel, Thomas Harrow stammered, clearly torn between his desire to be rid of his unwanted ward and his amazement at the opportunity being offered. Then perhaps you should summon her, Richard suggested, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a suggestion. When Isabel entered the drawing room a few minutes later, Richard felt the same jolt of attraction he had experienced during their first meeting. She wore a simple travelling dress of dark blue wool, and her hair was neatly arranged for her journey to Yorkshire. But there was something different about her demeanour, a resignation that spoke of dreams finally abandoned. Your Grace, she said, offering her usual perfect curtsy. I'm honoured to see you again. Miss Isabel, Richard replied, rising from his chair with a smile that transformed his austere features. I'm delighted to see you as well. I understand you're preparing to leave for Yorkshire. Yes, Your Grace. The Harrows have been kind enough to arrange a position for me as a governess. The way she said it, with quiet acceptance rather than enthusiasm, only confirmed Richard's suspicions about her true feelings regarding the arrangement. Before you commit to that course, Richard said gently, I wonder if you might consider an alternative. I'm in need of someone to oversee the restoration of the gardens at Westmere Park. It would be a position of considerable responsibility, requiring someone with both horticultural knowledge and administrative skills. I believe you might be exactly what I'm looking for. Isabel's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been hope. Your Grace, that's very kind, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for such a position. I am, Richard said firmly. The question is whether you would be interested in accepting it. For a long moment, Isabel simply stared at him, as if unable to believe what she was hearing. The Harrow family watched the exchange with expressions ranging from shock to dismay. Clearly, they had never expected their unwanted ward to receive such an extraordinary offer. The salary would be £50 per year, Richard continued, plus room and board at Westmere Park. You would have your own suite of rooms in the main house and complete authority over the garden restoration project. It would be challenging work, but I believe you would find it rewarding. £50, Isabel whispered, her face pale with shock. It was more money than she had ever dreamed of earning, more than enough to ensure her independence and security. Plus, room and board, Richard confirmed. And of course, you would be treated as a valued member of my household staff, with all the respect and consideration that entails. The emphasis he placed on the word respect was not lost on anyone in the room. He was offering Isabel not just employment, but dignity, something she had never received from the family that had raised her. I would be honored to accept such a position, Your Grace, Isabel said, her voice trembling with emotion. Thank you for your confidence in my abilities. Excellent, Richard said, his satisfaction evident. Then it settled. My carriage is at your disposal whenever you're ready to depart. Today? Mrs. Harrow interjected, her voice sharp with alarm. But surely there are arrangements to be made, references to be provided. I require no references beyond my own observation of Miss Isabel's capabilities, Richard replied coolly. And as for arrangements, I believe Miss Isabel's belongings are already packed for her journey to Yorkshire. It should be a simple matter to redirect them to Westmere Park instead. The speed with which he was removing Isabel from their household clearly unsettled the Harrow family, but there was little they could do to protest. Richard was a duke, one of the most powerful men in England, and his wishes carried the weight of law. An hour later, Isabel found herself seated in the most luxurious carriage she had ever seen, watching Thornfield Manor disappear behind her as they rolled down the drive. She could hardly believe what had happened. In the space of a single conversation, her entire life had been transformed. Your Grace, she said hesitantly, I hope you don't think me ungrateful, but I must ask, why are you doing this? Why would you offer such an opportunity to someone you barely know? Richard was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. He could hardly tell her the truth, that he had been unable to stop thinking about her since their first meeting, that he had investigated her circumstances out of a growing conviction that she deserved better, that his interest in her went far beyond her qualifications as a garden designer. Because, he said finally, I believe in recognizing talent and worth wherever I find it. You have both in abundance, Miss Isabel, and it would be a crime to waste such gifts on people who cannot appreciate them. Isabel felt tears prick her eyes at his words. After 22 years of being made to feel worthless, his faith in her abilities was almost overwhelming. "I won't disappoint you," she said quietly. "I promise you that." "I have no doubt of that," Richard replied, and the warmth in his voice made her heart skip in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. As the carriage rolled through the countryside toward Westmere Park, Isabel allowed herself to dream of a future she had never dared imagine. She was free of the Harrows at last, free to prove her worth to someone who actually valued her abilities. It was more than she had ever hoped for. She didn't know it yet, but it was only the beginning. The Duke of Westmere had rescued her from one life, but he was about to offer her something even more precious, the chance to discover what it meant to be truly loved. The awakening, Westmere Park, was a revelation that left Isabel speechless with wonder. As the ducal carriage swept up the mile-long drive, she found herself gazing at a mansion that seemed to have sprung from the pages of a fairy tale. The house itself was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, its pale stone facade gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, with perfectly proportioned windows and elegant columns that spoke of both wealth and exquisite taste. But it was the grounds that truly captured her imagination. Even in their current state of neglect, she could see the bones of what had once been one of England's finest gardens. Overgrown parterres hinted at formal French designs, while wild tangles of climbing roses suggested romantic English garden rooms waiting to be rediscovered. "It's magnificent," she breathed, unable to hide her awe as the carriage drew to a halt before the grand entrance. "It was," Richard replied, following her gaze across the sprawling landscape. "My grandfather was passionate about gardening, but after his death, my father had little interest in maintaining the grounds. I'm afraid 20 years of neglect have taken their toll." As they alighted from the carriage, Isabel was greeted by a small army of servants who had assembled to welcome their master home. At their head stood an elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes, who stepped forward with obvious pleasure. "Your Grace," he said with a deep bow, "welcome home. We weren't expecting you for another week." "Plans changed, Pemberton," Richard replied warmly. "I'd like you to meet Miss Isabel Harrow, who will be overseeing the restoration of the gardens. Miss Isabel, this is Pemberton, my butler, and the man who truly runs Westmere Park." Pemberton turned to Isabel with a smile that immediately put her at ease. "Miss Harrow, welcome to Westmere Park. It will be a pleasure to have someone taking proper care of the gardens again." "Thank you, Mr. Pemberton," Isabel replied, offering a slight curtsy. "I'm looking forward to the challenge." As they entered the house, Isabel felt overwhelmed by the sheer scale and grandeur of her surroundings. The entrance hall soared 3 stories high, with a magnificent staircase that curved gracefully upward beneath a painted ceiling that depicted scenes from classical mythology. Portraits of previous Dukes of Westmere gazed down from gilded frames, their aristocratic faces bearing a strong resemblance to the man walking beside her. "Your rooms are in the East Wing," Richard explained as they climbed the stairs. "I thought you might appreciate the morning light, and there's an excellent view of the gardens from the windows." The suite he showed her to was larger and more luxurious than anything Isabel had ever imagined occupying. The sitting room was decorated in shades of cream and gold, with elegant furniture that spoke of both comfort and quality. French doors opened onto a small balcony that overlooked the gardens, providing the perfect vantage point for planning the restoration work. "The bedroom is through here," Richard said, opening a door to reveal a chamber dominated by a 4-poster bed hung with silk curtains. "And there's a private dressing room as well. I hope you'll find everything to your satisfaction." Isabel turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your Grace, this is far too grand for someone in my position. Surely a simple room in the servants' quarters would be more appropriate." "Miss Isabel," Richard interrupted gently, "you are not a servant. You are a professional in my employ, and you will be treated accordingly. These rooms are yours for as long as you choose to stay at Westmere Park." The kindness in his voice, the respect with which he spoke to her, was almost more than Isabel could bear. After years of being made to feel like a burden, his treatment of her as a valued individual was overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting her voice to say more. "Now then," Richard said, his manner becoming more businesslike, "shall we take a tour of the gardens? I'm eager to hear your thoughts on what might be accomplished." The next 2 hours passed like a dream as Richard guided Isabel through the overgrown grounds of Westmere Park. Despite the years of neglect, she could see the magnificent design that lay beneath the tangle of weeds and overgrown shrubs. There were formal parterres that could be restored to their geometric perfection, a rose garden that needed only proper pruning to bloom again, and a series of garden rooms that could be transformed into intimate spaces for contemplation and entertainment. "The bones are all here," Isabel said excitedly as they stood on a terrace overlooking the main vista. It would be a matter of clearing away the overgrowth, replanting where necessary, and restoring the original design. With the right team of gardeners, it could be magnificent again. "How long do you think such a restoration would take?" Richard asked, though he found himself more interested in watching the animation in Isabel's face than in hearing her answer. 2 years, perhaps 3 for the complete project," Isabel replied, her mind already racing with possibilities. "We'd need to work in phases, clearing and assessment first, then structural repairs to paths and water features, followed by replanting. The rose garden could be restored within a single season, but the formal parterres would take longer." "And the cost?" Isabel hesitated, suddenly aware that she was discussing sums of money that were beyond her experience. I'm not certain, Your Grace. It would depend on how extensive the replanting needs to be, and whether you wanted to add any new features to the original design." "Money is no object," Richard said simply. "I want the gardens of Westmere Park to be the finest in England, and I'm prepared to spend whatever is necessary to achieve that goal." The casual way he dismissed the financial concerns that would have crippled most families reminded Isabel of the vast gulf between their positions in life. He was one of the wealthiest men in England, able to spend fortunes on garden restoration without a second thought, while she was a penniless orphan whose entire worldly possessions could fit in a single carpet bag. Yet he was treating her as if her opinions mattered, as if her expertise was valuable. It was a heady experience for someone who had spent her entire life being dismissed and ignored. That evening, Isabel dined alone in her sitting room, served by a maid who treated her with the same deference she would have shown to any honored guest. The meal was simple but elegant: roasted chicken with herbs, fresh vegetables from the estate's kitchen gardens, and a delicate syllabub for dessert. It was the finest food Isabel had ever tasted, made even more delicious by the knowledge that she was eating it as a valued member of the household, rather than as a charity case. After dinner, she stood on her balcony, looking out over the moonlit gardens and trying to absorb the magnitude of the change in her circumstances. This morning she had been preparing for a life of drudgery as a governess to ungrateful children in Yorkshire. Tonight, she was the honoured guest of a duke, charged with restoring one of England's great gardens to its former glory. It seemed impossible, like something from a fairy tale, but the silk curtains stirring in the evening breeze, the comfortable bed waiting for her in the next room, the respect with which she had been treated throughout the day, all of it was real. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reverie. When she opened it, she found Richard standing in the hallway, still dressed in his evening clothes, but with his cravat loosened and his dark hair slightly dishevelled. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, his voice softer than she had heard it before. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed for your first night at Westmere Park." "Everything is perfect, Your Grace," Isabel replied, acutely aware of how intimate this late-night visit felt. "I can't thank you enough for your kindness." "You don't need to thank me," Richard said, stepping closer. "I'm the one who should be grateful. You've given me hope that the gardens can be restored to their former beauty." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the moonlight casting silver shadows across the balcony behind her. Isabel was acutely aware of Richard's presence, of the way he was looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Miss Isabel," he said quietly, "I hope you know that your position here is secure for as long as you wish it to be. You need never fear being turned out or sent away again." The promise in his voice, the protection he was offering, brought tears to Isabel's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have, a place where I truly belong." "You belong here," Richard said firmly, his blue eyes holding hers. "Never doubt that." As he bid her good night and disappeared down the darkened hallway, Isabel remained standing in her doorway, her heart pounding with emotions she didn't dare name. The Duke of Westmere had rescued her from a life of servitude and given her opportunities beyond her wildest dreams. But as she prepared for bed in her luxurious chamber, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that he had given her something even more precious. The first taste of what it might be like to be valued, respected, and perhaps even loved. She didn't know it yet, but Richard Montague was falling as deeply under her spell as she was under his. The garden restoration project was just the beginning of something far more significant. a love story that would challenge every convention of their society and prove that true worth had nothing to do with birth or breeding. As Isabel drifted off to sleep in her silk-hung bed, she dreamed of gardens in full bloom and a future brighter than anything she had ever dared to imagine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities, but for the first time in her life, she faced the future with hope rather than fear. The unwanted burden had become a valued professional, but soon she would become something even more precious, the beloved of a duke who had finally found the woman worthy of his heart. The blossoming. The weeks that followed Isabel's arrival at Westmere Park passed in a blur of activity and discovery. True to his word, Richard had provided her with everything she needed to begin the garden restoration. A team of skilled gardeners, unlimited access to the finest nurseries in England, and the authority to make decisions that would have been unthinkable in her previous life. But it was the daily interactions with Richard himself that truly transformed Isabel's existence. Each morning, he would join her for a tour of the gardens, listening intently as she explained her plans and offering suggestions with the knowledge of someone who truly understood and appreciated the work being done. "The rose garden is coming along beautifully," he observed one crisp November morning as they walked among the newly pruned bushes. "I can already see the improvement from your work." Isabel flushed with pleasure at his praise. "It's satisfying work, Your Grace. These roses just needed proper care to flourish again. Next spring, they should bloom magnificently." "Like their caretaker," Richard said softly, then seemed surprised by his own words. The comment hung in the air between them, charged with meaning that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Isabel felt her cheeks burn with a blush that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. "Your Grace," she began hesitantly, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Richard," he said firmly, "when we're alone like this, please call me Richard. All this formality seems rather ridiculous when we're standing knee-deep in mulch, don't you think?" The suggestion was so improper that Isabel's first instinct was to refuse. A duke did not invite his employees to use his given name, no matter how kindly he treated them. But there was something in his eyes, a warmth and sincerity, that made her want to accept the intimacy he was offering. "Richard," she said quietly, testing the name on her tongue. It felt dangerous and wonderful at the same time. "Much better," he said with a smile that made her heart skip. "Now, what were you saying about the water feature in the East Garden?" As the days grew shorter and the first frost touched the gardens, Isabel found herself looking forward to these morning conversations with an anticipation that went far beyond professional interest. Richard was unlike any man she had ever known. Intelligent, cultured, and surprisingly well-informed about subjects ranging from horticulture to literature to the political issues of the day. More importantly, he treated her as an equal, valuing her opinions and seeking her advice on matters that extended beyond the gardens. When he mentioned his plans to modernize the estate's farming methods, he asked for her thoughts on crop rotation. When he discussed his charitable work in the local village, he sought her suggestions for improving conditions for the tenant families. "You have a remarkable mind," he told her one evening as they sat in his library, discussing a book of poetry they had both been reading. "I find myself wondering what you might have accomplished if you had been given the opportunities you deserved from the beginning." Isabel set down her teacup, her expression growing thoughtful. "I used to wonder about that too," she admitted, "but I've come to believe that perhaps my experiences, difficult as they were, have given me something valuable, an understanding of what it means to struggle, to be overlooked, to have to prove one's worth." "And now?" Richard asked, leaning forward in his chair. "Do you still feel you have to prove your worth?" "Not here," Isabel said softly, meeting his gaze. "Not with you. For the first time in my life, I feel valued, appreciated for who I am, rather than tolerated out of obligation." The honesty of her words, the vulnerability she was showing him, made Richard's chest tighten with emotion. He had been fighting his growing feelings for weeks, telling himself that his interest in Isabel was purely philanthropic. But sitting here in the firelight, watching the way her eyes sparkled with intelligence and warmth, he could no longer deny the truth. He was falling in love with her. The realization should have terrified him. He was a duke, expected to marry within his own social circle, to choose a wife who could bring political connections and social advantages to their union. Isabel Harrow, for all her intelligence and grace, was nobody. A penniless orphan with no family, no dowry, no connections that could benefit his position. But as he looked at her, Richard found that none of those considerations mattered. What mattered was the way she made him feel, more alive, more engaged with the world than he had been in years. What mattered was her kindness, her intelligence, her quiet strength that had allowed her to survive and even flourish despite years of neglect and rejection. "Isabel," he said quietly, setting down his own cup and moving to sit beside her on the sofa. "There's something I need to tell you." She looked up at him with those expressive brown eyes, and he felt his carefully planned words desert him entirely. Instead, he reached out to cup her face gently in his hands, marveling at the softness of her skin. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling with the same emotion he was feeling. "I know this is impossible," he said, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "I know that society would condemn us both, that there are 1,000 reasons why this can never be. But I can't pretend anymore that my feelings for you are merely those of an employer for a valued employee." "What are you saying?" Isabel asked, though her heart was already racing with the hope that she barely dared acknowledge. "I'm saying that I love you," Richard said simply. "I love your intelligence, your strength, your beautiful heart. I love the way you see the world, the way you care for things that others would overlook. I love everything about you, Isabel, and I don't care what anyone else thinks about it." Isabel felt tears spring to her eyes at his declaration. She had dreamed of hearing such words, but she had never truly believed they would come from someone like Richard, a man who could have any woman in England, but had chosen to love her. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I've tried not to. Tried to remember my place, but I can't help it. You've shown me what it means to be valued, to be respected, to be loved." Richard's response was to kiss her, a gentle, reverent touch that spoke of deep emotion and careful restraint. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the air between them crackled with possibility and danger. "What happens now?" Isabel asked, her practical nature asserting itself even in the midst of her emotional upheaval. "You're a duke, Richard. You can't marry someone like me." "Why not?" Richard asked, his voice fierce with determination. "Who says I can't? I'm not some puppet to be manipulated by society's expectations. I'm a free man, and I choose to love you. But the scandal will pass," Richard said firmly. "Scandals always do. But love like this, love that sees beyond birth and breeding to the true worth of a person, that's rare and precious. I won't let society's prejudices rob us of something so beautiful." Isabel wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in the future he was painting with his words. But she had lived too long on the margins of society to be naive about the challenges they would face. "Your family will never accept me," she said quietly. "Your friends, your peers, they'll see me as an opportunist, someone who seduced you for your title and fortune." "Then they don't know me very well," Richard replied. "Anyone who truly knows me would understand that I'm not a man to be easily seduced or manipulated. If I choose to marry you, it will be because you're the woman I want to spend my life with, not because you've somehow tricked me into it." The word marry hung in the air between them, more shocking and wonderful than Isabel had ever imagined it could be. A duke was speaking of marrying her, not as a mistress or a temporary diversion, but as his wife, his duchess. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "I'm telling you that I intend to marry you," Richard said with quiet conviction. "The only question is whether you'll have me." Isabel looked into his blue eyes, seeing the love and determination there, and felt her last defenses crumble. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Richard's kiss this time was deeper, more passionate, full of joy and relief, and the promise of a future they would build together. When they finally broke apart, both were laughing through their tears. "We'll need to be strategic about this," Richard said, his practical nature reasserting itself. "The announcement will need to be carefully managed, and we'll need allies who can help us weather the initial storm." "Are you already regretting your proposal?" Isabel teased, though there was a note of real concern in her voice. "Never," Richard said firmly, pulling her close again. "I'm simply planning our campaign. You're going to be my Duchess, Isabel Harrow, and I intend to make sure that everyone who matters recognizes your worth." As they sat together in the firelight, planning their impossible future, Isabel felt a sense of completion she had never experienced before. She was no longer the unwanted burden, surviving on the margins of other people's lives. She was a woman beloved by a duke, a man who saw her worth when the rest of the world saw only shame. It would be a battle, she knew. Society would resist their union with every weapon at its disposal, but with Richard beside her, she felt capable of facing any challenge. Love, it seemed, really could conquer all. The garden restoration project had brought them together, but it was their hearts that had truly bloomed. And like the roses she tended with such care, their love would only grow stronger and more beautiful with time. The storm and the triumph. The announcement of the Duke of Westmere's engagement to Miss Isabel Harrow sent shockwaves through London society that reverberated from the drawing rooms of Mayfair to the clubs of St. James's. The reaction was swift, brutal, and exactly as devastating as Isabel had feared it would be. A duke marrying a nobody? Lady Pemberton declared at her weekly salon, her voice dripping with disdain. It's absolutely scandalous. The girl has no family, no fortune, no breeding whatsoever. She's nothing more than a fortune hunter who has somehow ensnared poor Westmere. The gossip spread like wildfire through the ton, each retelling more vicious than the last. Isabel was variously described as a scheming adventuress, a fallen woman who had compromised the Duke, and a cunning manipulator who had used her position in his household to seduce him. The fact that no one actually knew anything about her background only made the speculation more creative and cruel. Richard faced the storm with characteristic determination, but even he was surprised by the vehemence of the opposition. His own mother, the Dowager Duchess of Westmere, arrived at Westmere Park within days of the announcement, her face a mask of aristocratic fury. "Richard," she said without preamble as she swept into his study, "what in God's name do you think you're doing? Have you taken leave of your senses entirely?" "Good morning, Mother," Richard replied calmly, not looking up from the correspondence he was reviewing. "I trust your journey from London was comfortable." "Don't you dare take that tone with me," the Dowager Duchess snapped. "I'm here to discuss this ridiculous engagement of yours. The entire family is in uproar. Your sister Charlotte has locked herself in her room in shame, and your cousin Henry is threatening to challenge you to a duel for bringing disgrace upon the family name." "Henry always was prone to dramatics," Richard observed mildly. "As for Charlotte, she'll recover once she meets Isabel and realizes what a remarkable woman she is." "Remarkable?" The Dowager Duchess's voice rose to a near shriek. "Richard, the girl is a nobody. She has no family, no connections, no fortune. What could you possibly see in such a creature?" Richard finally looked up from his papers, his blue eyes cold as winter ice. "I see intelligence, kindness, strength and beauty both inside and out. I see a woman who has faced adversity with grace and dignity, who has never allowed hardship to make her bitter or cruel. I see the woman I love, Mother, and the woman I intend to marry." "Love!" the Dowager Duchess spat. "You sound like some romantic fool from a novel. You are a duke, Richard. You have responsibilities, obligations to your family and your position. You cannot simply marry for love like some common tradesman." "I can and I will," Richard replied firmly. "I've spent 35 years fulfilling my obligations to family and society. Now I choose to fulfill my obligation to my own happiness." The argument continued for hours, with the Dowager Duchess alternately pleading, threatening, and raging at her son's stubborn refusal to abandon his engagement. But Richard remained unmoved, his determination only strengthened by his family's opposition. Meanwhile, Isabel found herself virtually imprisoned at Westmere Park, afraid to venture beyond the estate grounds for fear of the hostile reception she would receive. The local gentry, who had initially been curious about the Duke's mysterious garden designer, now treated her with open contempt. Invitations that had once been extended were quietly withdrawn, and the few social calls she received were clearly motivated by curiosity rather than friendship. "Perhaps we should reconsider," Isabel said one evening, as she and Richard walked through the gardens that had brought them together. "The opposition is so fierce, the scandal so great. I don't want to be the cause of your estrangement from your family." "Isabel," Richard said, stopping to take her hands in his, "look at me. Do you love me?" "You know I do," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "And I love you. That's all that matters. My family will come around eventually, and if they don't, that's their loss. As for society, let them gossip. In a year or two, they'll find some new scandal to occupy their attention, and we'll be left in peace to enjoy our happiness. But what if they don't? What if the scandal follows us forever? What if our children are made to suffer for our choices?" Richard's expression softened at the mention of children. "Their children. Our children will be loved, Isabel. They'll grow up knowing that their parents chose each other freely, that our marriage was built on genuine affection and respect rather than cold calculation. They'll be stronger for it, not weaker." Despite his confident words, Richard was well aware of the challenges they faced. His steward had already reported that several business associates were reconsidering their partnerships, unwilling to be associated with a duke who had made such a scandalous marriage. His political allies were distancing themselves, concerned about the impact on their own reputations. But it was a letter from his closest friend, Lord Ashford, that truly shook him. "Richard," the letter read, "I feel I must speak plainly as your oldest friend. This engagement is madness, and you know it. The girl may be charming enough, but she's completely unsuitable as a duchess. You're throwing away everything. Your reputation, your political future, your family's respect. For what? A pretty face and a moment's infatuation. I beg you to reconsider before it's too late. End this engagement now, provide the girl with a generous settlement, and choose a bride worthy of your position. Your friend, Ashford." The letter stung more than Richard cared to admit, not because he doubted his choice, but because it showed how completely even his closest friends misunderstood his feelings for Isabel. They saw only her lack of social standing, not her intelligence, her strength, her beautiful character. It was Isabel herself who provided the solution to their dilemma, though it came at a cost that nearly broke Richard's heart. "I've been thinking," she said one morning, as they reviewed the latest batch of hostile correspondence. "Perhaps there's a way to minimize the scandal and protect your position." "What do you mean?" Richard asked, though something in her tone made him wary. "We could have a quiet ceremony," Isabel said carefully. "Just the two of us, with minimal witnesses. No grand society wedding, no announcements in the papers. We could marry privately, and then gradually introduce me to society as your wife, giving people time to adjust to the idea." "Absolutely not," Richard said immediately. "I won't skulk around as if I'm ashamed of you. When we marry, it will be with all the ceremony and celebration befitting a duchess. You deserve nothing less." "Richard, be practical," Isabel pleaded. "A grand wedding would only inflame the opposition further. If we marry quietly, we can weather the initial storm and then work to win people over gradually." "No," Richard said firmly. "I understand your reasoning, but I won't start our marriage by hiding it away like some shameful secret. You're going to be my Duchess, Isabel, and I want the world to know it." In the end, they compromised. The wedding would take place at Westmere Park, rather than in London, with only family and close friends in attendance. It wasn't the grand society event that would normally mark a ducal wedding, but it wasn't the furtive ceremony Isabel had suggested either. The guest list was small but significant. Richard's sister, Charlotte, despite her initial shock, had come around after meeting Isabel and recognizing her genuine worth. His cousin Henry, still disapproving but unwilling to create a permanent rift in the family, agreed to attend. Even the Dowager Duchess, though she maintained her opposition to the match, declared that she would not miss her son's wedding, regardless of her feelings about his choice of bride. "She may not approve," Richard told Isabel as they finalized the arrangements, "but she's too much of a duchess herself to allow family business to become public spectacle. She'll be there, and she'll be civil, even if she's not enthusiastic." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of Westmere Park's chapel. Isabel stood before her mirror, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. Her wedding gown was a masterpiece of ivory silk and Brussels lace, created by London's finest modiste and paid for by Richard despite her protests about the expense. "You look beautiful, miss," said her maid Sarah as she made final adjustments to Isabel's veil. "His Grace is the luckiest man in England." Isabel smiled at the young woman's enthusiasm, but her stomach was churning with nerves. In an hour, she would become the Duchess of Westmere, one of the highest-ranking women in England. The girl who had been rejected by her own family would take her place among the aristocracy, whether they welcomed her or not. A soft knock at the door announced the arrival of Charlotte, Richard's sister, who had surprised everyone by becoming one of Isabel's strongest supporters. "Isabel," she said warmly, "you look absolutely radiant. Richard is going to be speechless when he sees you." "Thank you, Charlotte," Isabel replied, grateful for the other woman's friendship. "I'm terrified, to be honest. What if I make some terrible mistake? What if I embarrass Richard in front of his family?" "You won't," Charlotte said firmly. "You're one of the most gracious women I've ever met. Richard chose well, and anyone with sense will see that." The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion and nervous excitement. Isabel walked down the aisle on the arm of Richard's cousin Henry, who had grudgingly agreed to give her away in the absence of any family of her own. Richard waited at the altar, magnificent in his dress uniform, his blue eyes fixed on her face with such love and devotion that her nervousness melted away. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Richard kissed her, the small congregation erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the chapel. As they walked back down the aisle together, Isabel caught sight of the Dowager Duchess, who was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief despite her continued disapproval of the match. The wedding breakfast was an elegant affair, held in Westmere Park's grand dining room. The conversation was somewhat stilted, with several guests clearly struggling to reconcile their social prejudices with their genuine affection for Richard, but it was civil and even occasionally warm. It was during the toasts that the true significance of the day became clear. Richard rose to address his guests, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "My friends," he began, "today I have married the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Isabel has shown me what it means to love someone not for their title or their fortune, but for their character, their intelligence, their beautiful heart. She has faced adversity with grace, rejection with dignity, and hardship with strength. If that isn't the mark of true nobility, then I don't know what is." He turned to look at Isabel, his eyes shining with emotion. "My Duchess," he said softly, "you have made me the happiest man alive. I promise to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of your love." The applause that followed was genuine and heartfelt, and Isabel felt tears of joy streaming down her face. She had found her fairy tale ending, not because she had married a duke, but because she had found a man who loved her completely and unconditionally. As the guests departed, and the newlyweds were finally alone, Richard took Isabel's hand and led her out to the gardens that had brought them together. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing the question he had posed on their wedding day. "Only that we can't do it all over again," Isabel replied, her heart so full of happiness she thought it might burst. "It was perfect, Richard, more beautiful than anything I ever imagined." "It was only the beginning," Richard said, pulling her into his arms. "We have the rest of our lives to create more perfect moments, more beautiful memories." As they stood together in the moonlight, surrounded by the gardens that had bloomed under Isabel's care and the promise of a future they would build as equals, Isabel knew that she had finally found her place in the world. She was no longer the unwanted burden, the girl who didn't belong anywhere. She was the Duchess of Westmere, beloved by her husband and ready to take her place in society, whether they welcomed her or not. And with Richard beside her, she felt capable of facing any challenge the future might bring. The Duchess's triumph. 4 years later, the grand ballroom of Westmere House in London blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their golden glow reflecting off crystal chandeliers and gilded mirrors. The cream of society had gathered for the annual Westmere Charity Ball, an event that had become one of the most sought-after invitations of the London season. At the centre of it all stood Isabel Montague, the Duchess of Westmere, resplendent in a gown of midnight blue silk that perfectly complemented the Westmere sapphires at her throat. Her transformation from the rejected orphan of Thornfield Manor to one of society's most respected hostesses was complete and undeniable. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton approached with a smile that would have been unthinkable 4 years earlier. "What a magnificent evening. The funds raised tonight for the orphanages will make such a difference to those poor children." "Thank you, Lady Pemberton," Isabel replied graciously. "It's gratifying to see such generous support for the cause." The irony was not lost on Isabel that the same woman who had once dismissed her as a nobody now sought her approval and friendship. But Isabel had learned to accept such reversals with grace, understanding that society's acceptance, while shallow, was necessary for the work she wanted to accomplish. "Mama! Mama!" A small voice called out, and Isabel turned to see her 3-year-old son, Thomas, running toward her with his nursemaid in pursuit. The boy was the image of his father, with golden hair and bright blue eyes, but he had inherited his mother's gentle nature and quick intelligence. "Thomas," Isabel said, sweeping him up in her arms despite the formality of the occasion. "You should be in bed, young man." "Couldn't sleep," Thomas declared solemnly. "Too much music. Papa said I could say good night." Richard appeared at her side, magnificent in his evening dress, his eyes warm with love as he looked at his wife and son. "I may have mentioned that exception could be made for a very quick good night," he admitted with a smile. "Very well," Isabel said, kissing her son's forehead. "But then straight to bed with no arguments." As the nursemaid led Thomas away, Richard slipped his arm around Isabel's waist. "You've outdone yourself tonight," he murmured. "The ball is a tremendous success, and you look absolutely radiant." "We've outdone ourselves," Isabel corrected. "This was our project, remember?" It was true. The charity work that had become Isabel's passion was something they had undertaken together, using their combined influence and resources to create real change in the lives of London's most vulnerable children. The orphanages they supported, the schools they had founded, the legislation they had helped pass, all of it bore the mark of their partnership. "The Duchess of Marlborough was just telling me how much she admires your work with the education bill," Richard continued. "She said you've become quite the political force." Isabel laughed softly. "Who would have thought that the unwanted burden of Thornfield Manor would one day be lobbying members of Parliament?" "I would have," Richard said seriously. "I saw your strength and intelligence from the very beginning. Society was simply too blind to recognize what was right in front of them." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Dowager Duchess, who had finally, grudgingly, come to accept her daughter-in-law. The older woman's transformation had been gradual but genuine, particularly after the birth of her grandson. "Isabel, my dear," she said warmly, "you've created another triumph. The Duke of Wellington himself was just praising your speech about the children's welfare legislation." "Thank you, Mother," Isabel replied, using the title that had once seemed impossible. "Your support has meant everything to us." It was true. The Dowager Duchess's eventual acceptance had been crucial in winning over the rest of society. Once she had publicly embraced Isabel as her daughter-in-law, the remaining opposition had crumbled with surprising speed. As the evening wore on and the last guests departed, Isabel and Richard found themselves alone in the ballroom, surrounded by the remnants of their successful evening. Servants moved quietly around them, clearing away glasses and extinguishing candles, but the couple remained in their own private world. "Do you ever think about that first day in the garden at Westmere Park?" Richard asked, pulling Isabel into his arms for a slow dance to music only they could hear. "Every day," Isabel replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "I was so frightened, so uncertain about everything. I never imagined it would lead to all this." "To what? The title? The position in society?" "No," Isabel said, lifting her head to meet his eyes. "To happiness, to belonging somewhere, to being loved for who I am, rather than what I can provide. And our son, our work, the difference we're making? All of it," Isabel said softly. "But mostly to you, to us, to this love that proved everyone wrong about what really matters." Richard spun her gently, her silk skirts swirling around them like midnight clouds. "You know what the best part is?" he said, as he drew her close again. "What?" "We're just getting started. Thomas will have siblings soon, God willing. Our work with the orphanages is expanding. The education bill will pass next session. We have a lifetime of adventures ahead of us." Isabel smiled, her heart full to overflowing. "A lifetime of proving that love really can conquer all. Even the prejudices of the ton," Richard agreed with a laugh. "Though I admit, I never thought I'd see the day when Lady Pemberton would be asking your advice on charitable work." "People change," Isabel said philosophically, "or perhaps they simply recognize strength when they finally see it clearly." As they swayed together in the candlelit ballroom, Isabel reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had been rejected by her own family had become one of the most influential women in England. The orphan who had known only cold charity had created a loving family of her own. The woman who had been deemed unworthy of respect had earned the admiration of society through her own merits. "Isabel," Richard said quietly, "I need you to know something." "What?" "That first day at Thornfield Manor when I saw you in the garden, I knew. I can't explain how, but I knew you were going to change my life." "You saved my life," Isabel replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You saw worth in me when no one else did. You gave me the chance to become who I was meant to be." "We saved each other," Richard corrected. "You gave my life meaning, purpose beyond duty and obligation. You taught me what it means to love someone completely." As the last candle was extinguished and they made their way upstairs to their private apartments, Isabel felt a profound sense of completion. She had found her fairy tale ending, not because she had married a duke, but because she had found a man who loved her unconditionally and a life that allowed her to make a real difference in the world. The unwanted burden had become a beloved duchess. The rejected orphan had become a respected advocate for the forgotten children of society. But more than any title or position, she had become herself, fully, completely, and without apology. In their private sitting room, Richard poured 2 glasses of champagne and handed one to his wife. "To us," he said, raising his glass. "To love," Isabel replied, touching her glass to his. "To the love that proved everyone wrong about what really matters. To the most beautiful love story between a duke and the woman who was never truly rejected, just waiting for the right person to recognize her worth." As they drank their champagne and planned for the future, for the children they would have, the work they would do, the love they would share, Isabel knew that her story was far from over. It was, in fact, just beginning. The girl who had learned that family could be the cruelest strangers had created a family built on love and respect. The woman who had been taught to believe she was nothing had discovered that she was everything to the right person. And in the gardens of Westmere Park, the roses she had tended with such care continued to bloom year after year, as beautiful and enduring as the love that had brought them together. From unwanted burden to beloved duchess, this is the love story that proves worth comes from the heart, not the bloodline. If you believe that true love can overcome any obstacle and that every person deserves to be valued for who they truly are, like this incredible journey. Don't forget to subscribe for more breathtaking historical romances that celebrate the triumph of love over prejudice. Share in the comments. Which moment touched your heart the most? When Richard first saw Isabel's worth, or when she finally claimed her place as Duchess? Let's celebrate love that changes everything.